If you've read the New Testament or the Apostolic writings, then there have probably been parts that you've read that you've been confused about or you haven't understood the references. Let's take, for example, the book of Hebrews. Towards the end of the book of Hebrews, in what's commonly known as the Hall of Faith, it talks about people who gave themselves over to death, hoping for a better resurrection. Who is that referring to? Or later it will say that somebody was even sawn in two. What is that talking about? Or what about this? In Paul's first letter to Timothy, his young protege, he talks about Jannes and Jambres opposing Moses. Who are these guys? I've read the Torah, but I've never heard of Jannes and Jambres. Or what about in Jude? Jude, when he writes his epistle, he quotes and says that this person, Enoch, prophesied about the coming of the Lord to judge the wicked and the righteous. But if you go back and you read about Enoch, there's like 3 verses in the whole Bible that actually tell about the time of Enoch. So where are these people getting these things from? You may have also read in the Bible that it refers to other books, like the books of the wars of the Lord, or the books of the wars of Yahweh. Or what about the book of Jasher, the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, and the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Now, as I read through the Bible when I was younger, I remember thinking, man, I really want to read through these books, the book of Jasher, the book of the wars of Yahweh. And I hate to disappoint you, but we will not be talking about those in this video. The reason being, even though you might find those books on Amazon when you search them up, those are not real books that have actually been discovered. And those books that you find on Amazon are not the real deal. We do not have those. And it makes sense, seeing as what was produced from those books, the scriptures that Christians commonly call the Old Testament, that are seen as much more valuable, and that the Jews wanted to hold on first and foremost when the Babylonian exile happened and all the temple was destroyed and all Judah. They wanted to hold on to their more important books. And yet, we barely have Hebrew scripture fragments from before the Babylonian exile, like the silver amulets. And most of what we have, really the oldest, more complete, and even that is more fragmentary, manuscripts that we have for the Hebrew scriptures, the Dead Sea Scrolls, date really to the 2nd century before Christ. So, it's no surprise that we still don't have those. However, when we read about the apostles, many of these references that they make, we actually do have the texts that they are referring to. And these so-called lost books of the Bible are, for the most part, actually only really lost to us Christians in the West. Starting in the 1800s, more of us Protestant Christians. And in fact, to varying different levels, Christians, more or less, actually have these books. For example, you may have heard this story about this book of Enoch that was originally part of the canon of Scripture, and it was considered on the same level as the other books, but in the First Council of Nicaea, they deemed it as heretical, burned all the books, threw them away, and it was taken out. Yeah, not really. On either of those. One, it wasn't really considered canonical by any of the Jews around the time of Jesus or afterwards, except for maybe a couple Christians. And 2, it wasn't really burned and completely destroyed. In fact, there are Christian traditions that continue to hold it as canonical, namely the Ethiopic Orthodox Church. They also have the Book of Jubilees and many other books. They have at least 80 books in their canon. Besides that, there's also the Orthodox Christians that have even more books than the Catholics. And then the Catholics have lots of books. But even then, none of these books of the Bible are actually Catholic books of the Bible or Orthodox books of the Bible, any more than the Old Testament is a Christian book of the Bible. Actually, less so than that, because the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures is really talking about Jesus, as Jesus says in the 24th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. These books are actually Jewish. They're Jewish works from around the time of Jesus, which we will call the Second Temple period. Now, the term intertestamental period is often used, but it's actually not very helpful for a couple of reasons. One, some of the dates for a lot of the Hebrew scriptures are actually debatable, and so the intertestamental period could be argued to be super short or super long. Second of all, the intertestamental period, quote unquote, is actually very much inspired by the Hebrew scriptures and inspires the apostolic writings. And it's very similar to a lot of them in a lot of ways. And so it's not really, in a lot of ways, too distinct from the two. However, it did have many people writing a lot of texts that they did not believe were going to be a part of the Hebrew scriptures or any type of canon. Now, there is a possibility that the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls thought that one of these books, and maybe one of their own sectarian writings, that is, a text that they wrote themselves, but that was not shared outside of their more cultish community, it may be that they thought Jubilees and this other work were actually canonical. They do quote Jubilees, for example, and talk about how God has made it harder for older people. And they actually run their community based on that guideline, putting certain restrictions on people over the age of 60 because that text, Jubilees, talks about older people having those problems. However, even then, that does not mean that the book of Jubilees actually saw itself as being canonical. So, these texts are not all the way canonical. They really aren't. And they haven't been viewed that way. In fact, some people have argued that there were multiple different types of Jews in the times of Jesus. And yes, there certainly were. However, some, especially Roman Catholics, will often argue that there were different types of Jews that had different canons. Mainly in Alexandria, Egypt, the second largest epicenter of Jews other than Palestine and Israel, that they had a different canon where they held the deuterocanonical books, what the Catholics will call them, or what some might call the Apocrypha, where these Alexandrian Jews actually held those as canonical. Well, that's just not true. And in fact, we have authors from that place and that time, namely Philo of Alexandria, and Philo is obsessed with Torah. Sometimes he quotes from the other books of the Hebrew scriptures, but he does not quote or even reference these deuterocanonical books. In fact, the closest thing we have to that, a different canon, is, of course, those Dead Sea Scroll community writers. So, these books are not canonical. The authors did not see it that way, and the vast majority of Jews did not see it that way. Josephus talks about this, how there's not really dispute among the different Jews about their canon. He writes about this in his text called Against Apion, and how they all hold the same canon. This is referred to even within the Apocrypha itself. The earliest apocryphal writer, one of the earlier, actually, not the earliest, Jesus, the son of Sirah, says he refers to the actual TaNaKh. And I go into a little bit of this also in my past video on the internal organization of the original ordering of the Old Testament. So I'm going to leave that to that. But I do also want to put pressure on those that want to say that these books are heretical, they're evil, they're terrible, and they want to push all the way back in the opposite direction to defend against what has been said that these are canonical and that they should be thrown into the scriptures. And that is simply not the case. There are some parts of this that are not totally true. Of course, these are Second Temple Jewish authors and readers. So they didn't have the scriptures revealed to them as being fulfilled in Jesus. They weren't Christians, they were Jews. So of course they're going to have some things wrong. However, these are also people who did not just hold the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures as holy, they held them as their own history for their own people that was actually a lot more recent for them than it was for us. So if anything, we could learn from them. Now, I brought up a lot of specific examples from the apostolic scriptures that make references to things found in these texts. Now, that does not mean that the apostolic authors, the apostles themselves, actually read these texts or knew about them. There's no way for us to know. Now, Jude, he just directly quotes from 1 Enoch. So he did know at least that section of 1 Enoch. However, as for Jannes and Jambres, the person sawn in 2, or the people that died, we don't know, because in that time, information was spread a lot differently than it is today. There was what was known as an oral tradition. But there wasn't just one oral tradition, there were many oral traditions that conflicted or that had different things. And they pull from many different of these traditions. And these texts also pull from it. So, we can't know for sure that the author of 1 Timothy, Paul, when he talks about Jannes and Jambres, is actually pulling from the text Jannes and Jambres. He could very well be pulling from a source even outside of that, where people were passing on by tongue, by word of mouth, this extra biblical tradition. We don't know. It could just be this extra biblical tradition that's held in both of these texts. The more major and popular that the text is, the more likely that it is that they knew it, especially if they're directly quoting from it, like Jude. With all that said, I want to actually look at these texts, what they are, how they help us to understand the Hebrew scriptures, and their connection to the apostolic scriptures, if they have any. And you'll notice, actually, that here I have the TaNaKh written, and I'm talking about Second Temple literature. That's stuff written around the time of the Second Temple. So that's from about the 5th century before Christ to 70 years after the incarnation. But actually, usually this is held on a couple years past that to talk about literature that was written about the Second Temple, even if that's the destruction of the Second Temple. So sometimes books like 2 or 4 Esdras, which that's just really complicated as to which name it should go by, because sometimes it's called 2, sometimes it's called 4 Esdras. But either way, that is generally considered a Second Temple text, even though it's actually in response to the destruction of the Second Temple, which means that the author who was writing it wrote it after the Second Temple had been destroyed. But it's still considered a Second Temple text because it has to do with the Second Temple, and the person who wrote it was grieved by the Second Temple being destroyed, meaning that the Second Temple had meaning for them, and it was significant, and that it formed their literature. And then there's also Josephus, who writes after and actually about the destruction of the Second Temple. And again, he's considered a Second Temple author, even though he's writing after the destruction of the Second Temple, because he's actually talking about how the Second Temple was destroyed. Again, that assumes that the Second Temple was very important for him. Now, the TaNaKh is considered, or at least should be considered, a Second Temple text. At the very least, we have books like Haggai, Zechariah, or maybe Zephaniah, I get those mixed up, Ezra and Nehemiah, and Chronicles even though it doesn't talk about the building of the Second Temple, it has genealogies that go generations past the exile and into and past the time of the creation of the Second Temple. So that was also authored, at least partially, during the time of the Second Temple. And also, Bible scholars do not deny whether they confess that the scriptures are important and revelation from God or not. All biblical scholars know that the Bible was redacted. It had its finishing touches in the time of the Second Temple period. Now, to what extent, that is often debated. But we know this even from reading the Hebrew scriptures themselves. Think about this. In the Torah, it talks about how Og, king of Bashan, was destroyed by the Israelites as they were coming in and heading towards Canaan, and how you can find his metal bed even to that day. Well, it wouldn't make sense for Moses to write that you could find his bed to that day, because Moses was there when they killed Og, king of Bashan. So that had to be written some time later. Now, probably before the Babylonian exile, because if anything, they would have taken that with them. But there are other times in Genesis where it talks about before there was a king of Edom or from Israel. There are all these types of references looking forward to the future. So again, we don't know to what extent, I'm not going to argue to what extent that it was made its final touches by these final redactors, but the TaNaKh is considered, to one extent or another, a Second Temple text. Also, the apostles grew up during the time of the Second Temple. In fact, the Holy Spirit came down at Pentecost at the Second Temple. And yes, the Second Temple was destroyed before much of the writings of the New Testament or the apostles. Nonetheless, they were still influenced by the Second Temple and a lot of these Second Temple writings. So I wanted to point that out because I think that that's important. I'm also going to be sharing resources and references so that if you want to actually look into any of these texts for yourselves, I will let you know what you can look into for yourself. So up at the top, I have some of the books that tend to be a little bit more abstract, and then down towards the bottom, generally speaking, these texts are more historical, although that kind of varies from list to list. So, just in general, outside the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, which I will go on to explain, we have authors like the author Philo of Alexandria. Now, again, Alexandria is an important city in Egypt, named after Alexander the Great. So it was a very Greekified or Hellenized city. This was also the second biggest group of Jews altogether, because there was the Elephantine temple in Alexandria, Egypt. So there was a second temple that was made in Egypt that was a replica of the temple in Palestine. And so there were a lot of Jews in that area, and they had been very influenced by Greek thinking. And so our friend Philo over here is actually the first person to write a commentary on the book of Genesis, as well as the book of Exodus. Not as much of a commentary, although he does go over the Decalogue, over all the other laws, and over the life of Moses. So he's really the first commentator to talk directly through treatises or essays about the Torah and to interpret it. And he is, again, he's a philosopher. So if you're interested in philosophy, especially if you know people like Plato or Zeno, the Stoics, or Pythagoras, this is your guy. Because he has, as all these Hellenized or Greekified Jews have been, he has been influenced by his Greek culture. And so he's not only commentating on the Hebrew scriptures and specifically the Torah, but he's doing that from a Greek way of thinking. And in fact, a lot of his writings and his thinking prefigures the church fathers. So for example, the church fathers often did a lot of allegorical interpretation. And Philo of Alexandria also does a lot of allegorical interpretation. He is kind of the godfather of allegorical interpretation. Again, following after the Greek style of reading and interpretation. He's a really fascinating author in how he looks at all these different scriptures through that Greek mindset. And he even talks about Plato being a disciple of Moses. It's almost like for him, these Greek philosophers were Jews themselves. But another really important thing about Philo of Alexandria is he talks about the divine logos a lot. Now, logos is the Greek term often translated as word. So think of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And Philo of Alexandria would agree. In fact, Philo of Alexandria is the person that talks about the word so much. He says that just about everything is the word. The way in which the Israelites were going through the desert, that's the word. The image of God in which Adam and Eve were made, that's the word. The bread, the showbread that's put in the temple, that's the word. It's the word of God. And the word is with God, and it is God. Philo talks about these very things. In fact, if you see him interpret Genesis 18, where Abraham invites 3 strangers into his home, and oftentimes you'll see people talk about that being the Trinity and the 3 persons of the Trinity. It's so interesting. If you read Philo of Alexandria's own interpretation of that passage, you'll see he almost sounds Christian. He just needs to use the terms Father, Son, and Spirit. Now, he doesn't exactly explain the Trinity. Again, he's not fully there. He's not a Christian. In fact, he's living from 20 BC to 50 AD, and he's living in Egypt and not in Palestine, Israel. But his thinking is very similar to John's beginning of his gospel. It's influenced by the beginning creation narrative where God creates with his word, and the prophets, where the word of the Lord comes to the prophets and says something. Again, the word of Yahweh is coming to these people. I don't know about you, but my word doesn't travel and it doesn't speak. It doesn't seem like that's an idiom. It seems like God's word is an actual living being. And that's what Philo picks up on. That's his assumption behind it. And he's also influenced by Proverbs 8 and wisdom being with God and creating with him. So Philo of Alexandria was very much inspired by that. He wasn't all the way there, but he had a lot of writings that were so similar to the Gospel of John that the Church Fathers decided to preserve his writings. Great author, highly recommend that you read him. The most affordable translation right now of all his works that's out is this one by C.D. Young, and it has everything that he's written. However, if you're looking for more up-to-date or better translation, then you're going to want to go with the Loeb translation. And there's another translation, I can't remember the author at the moment, who this translator is working on Philo of Alexandria, a full text right now. And I think you can get that as ebook if you want. So that's one author, Philo of Alexandria. You also have the author of a treatise on the Maccabees, or really, they're the Hasmoneans, the descendants of Asmoneus. And 4 Maccabees talks about the story of 2 Maccabees, but it uses it as a type of argument for how reason is superior over the emotions. Again, it's very influenced by the Greek thinking, but it's using this Jewish historical moment to argue for this. So that's a treatise. It's often considered within the Apocrypha or even in the Pseudepigrapha, but it's a treatise or an essay. It's simply anonymous. So I think possibly you could contain it in the Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha, but it seems more just like something similar to Philo of Alexandria. Again, it's just anonymous. You also have the rabbis, which I must be honest, I haven't read for myself. But they are the authors of the texts like the Midrash and the Talmud and the Gemara and so on and so forth. Now, the rabbis actually wrote down these Second Temple traditions later in more like the 2nd century after Christ. So, they didn't write it when it was actually happening. We also have the historian Flavius Josephus. Now, this one right here, it's translated by William Whiston. This is the most affordable translation of all his works. But the translation is horrid. I believe this is from the 18th century, and a whole paragraph will be one sentence. The translator has some very interesting notes that are very outdated, so if you're going to read this, just know that the translator already has his own things that he's looking for to prove, and a lot of his scholarship is out of date. His wording is out of date. It's super hard to understand, no matter how intelligent you are. He was one of the people that updated the King James Version, but we're not talking about in the 20th century. He updated it in the 18th century. So if you can read the KJV from the 18th century recension, then go right ahead. This is just fine. A better translation would be the Loeb translation. That is significantly more expensive because they only come in small volumes based on his works. And then Oxford, I believe, has published their own translation, but it's only of the War of the Jews, I believe, which is his second work, which is going from just after the time of the completion of the scriptures up to the destruction of the temple. And he tells that whole history. That's probably one of his most major works, next to what he calls the Antiquity of the Jews, where he's trying to explain to his audience the origins of the Jews and that you can actually trace them back to the very beginning. Now, Josephus is basing his history off of the Hebrew scriptures and some of these other Apocrypha, such as 1 Maccabees. He also uses the letter of Aristeas and 1 Esdras. Besides that, he's using the Hebrew scriptures and he's explaining all the way from Adam up to his day, but he's retelling the story in his own words. So you can even see how he would interpret scripture and thought about certain theological ideas. But he's a historian. A lot of people talk about how biased he is. Of course, we all have our biases when we record history. There are other people who want to be a little bit more careful about how much they put him down, because he does have a lot of valuable insights for the history, the destruction of the Second Temple. If you want to know about the destruction of the Second Temple, this is your guy to read. He also goes in depth onto the Maccabees, and he has some really good things to say on that history. And as well, he gives his own interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures. So that's Josephus. You also have the very well-known and famous Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, if you want to read the Dead Sea Scrolls and actually understand them, then you have to get the translation by Giza Vermes. Now, he has a translation with the Penguin Classics. He also has his own just published somewhere else. If you pick this up, you will actually be able to read it and understand it. This is the most understandable translation. However, if you actually want to be able to cite what you're reading, this translation does not have a very good way of figuring out where you're at and referencing what you actually want to, what you quoted. So if you want to write papers for Bible studies or seminary or whatever it be from the Dead Sea Scrolls, then you need to pick up the translation by Florentino Garcia Martinez. Now, it's not complete. It doesn't have all of them, but it has the vast majority of them. And his is significantly harder to understand and more ambiguous. So I would recommend that you read these two side by side. And if you can read Hebrew, then he also has a significantly more expensive study edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls that has all of them, and you can cite it. And if you know the Hebrew, then the translation doesn't matter. You can just read it for yourself. But what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Now, I remember being in high school trying to make an apologetic argument that the Bible can be trusted because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I explained that these were Bible manuscripts, the original ones that were left in the Dead Sea and then washed up to shore, and we found them in the 20th century. Now, where I got that, I think I just connected the word Dead Sea and scroll, and I knew that they were the oldest Bible manuscripts, and so I just filled in the gaps with what I wanted. But actually, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the scrolls that are found near the Dead Sea in a very dry area called near Wadi Qumran. So there were some caves where a lot of Jews were probably living by. Some people say there weren't Jews living by there. There's a whole lot of debates there. And there's actually good reasons to believe both sides. But it really seems like there were Jews that were living by this area near the Dead Sea. And they started their own sectarian community. It's almost even cultish. But they do have some really good insights. So these are not proto-Christians. In fact, they would have rejected Jesus. We know this because unlike any other type of community, they have their written community rule of how their community functions. And they're very strict. They're about very strict rules. They have this supper, this meal that they enjoy together. They have their own ranks and sort of caste system, so as to say. And actually, the Pharisees are not the strictest interpreters of Torah and the laws. The Dead Sea Scroll authors are. Whereas the Pharisees may have said that Sabbath starts at sundown on the evening before Saturday, these Dead Sea Scroll authors would say, actually, no. Whenever you see that the sun is a sun's length from touching the horizon, then it starts. And to Jesus, who would pick grain from a field on the Sabbath, they said that is outright wrong. They also said, Jesus says, how many of you, if you had an oxen that was stuck in a well or in a pit, would not bring it out? And they would say, if there's an oxen or an animal stuck in a pit on the Sabbath, you cannot bring it out. In fact, if there's another human being in a pit or drowning in a well, you cannot pull them out. That is working on the Sabbath. But one of the helpful things about them is all the rest of this Christian literature, minus the rabbis, it's from diverse, different beliefs, different types of Jews, but they have all been conserved by the Christians because the Christians noticed how these Jews, even before Jesus, noticed things that they would go on later to notice, and that helps show the development before Christianity. But as they preserved these texts, they also inserted some of their own opinions. So every time they saw a point, not every time, but in many texts, they would add in their own part, and they would make it look like these people were actually prophesying about Jesus. Now, this isn't really true of the Apocrypha. That's not true about the Apocrypha. It's true of a couple of the Pseudepigrapha, and some argue more or less about to what extent there were what we call interpolations, later additions. And in none of these texts, actually, do we have those interpolations. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know, do not have interpolations because we didn't start to discover them until the 19th century. When we found one text, first called the Zadokite fragment, and later when it was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because it was found outside the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Cairo Geniza, in Egypt, and then later in the 20th century, we found that same text in the Qumran community in their caves. And so those texts we know have not been touched by Christians, and they haven't been added on to. But the Dead Sea Scrolls have, as I show, they have some manuscripts for the Bible, as you probably know, oldest biblical manuscripts. They have some of their own texts, like the community rule, that is not Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha, and I'm about to get into what that is in a second. They have some of their own Apocrypha that they have written, and they also have some copies of the Apocrypha, like Tobit and I believe Jesus, son of Sirah. And they also have Pseudepigrapha. Again, they very well may have believed that the book of Jubilees was inspired and that it was canonical, and so they have their own copy of that. They also have their own Pseudepigrapha that they made for themselves called the Book of Giants, and that's very connected to one Enoch. Now, what is the Apocrypha? What is the Pseudepigrapha? If you're a Protestant and you know a little bit about this literature, you may know that the Apocrypha are the Catholic books, and possibly you know that the Pseudepigrapha are those fake books that people tried to write to convince people to read them and add it into the Bible. Again, this is a gross oversimplification. First of all, the Apocrypha was not written by Catholics. It was written by Jews. Now, some of the ideas do prefigure Catholicism. For example, in 2 Maccabees, you have people who are praying for the dead. Now, you don't find this in any of this other Jewish literature. but you do find it in 2 Maccabees. And that is a Catholic idea. But that Catholic idea actually originates from that Greekified, Hellenized, Jewish text, 2 Maccabees. So, again, they aren't Catholic. Perhaps you could argue that some of them are proto-Catholic. And a lot of people do use the term Apocrypha to refer to texts outside the Bible. But what a lot of people don't do is they don't say that the Apocrypha is this larger section and within it is also Pseudepigrapha. And that seems to be how it should be recognized. The Apocrypha is not a neatly bound book. It shouldn't be a neatly bound book. It's not this own smaller canon, because the Apocrypha disagrees with itself. For example, these books, many of them have moral exhortations, talking about not lying and telling the truth. But then you have the book of Judith, where a lady actually lies so that she can defeat these people who are coming to destroy the Israelites. And she does it on the basis of Simeon and Levi going around killing people who had taken Dinah, their sister, and raped her. And they lie to destroy these people. And so it actually disagrees even with itself. 1 Maccabees does not talk about the story from 2 Maccabees. 2 Maccabees has its own story. And again, that's not necessarily disagreeing. But even Jesus, son of Sirah, is really sexist and has a lower view of women than any of these other extra-biblical texts. Jesus, son of Sirah, also talks about wisdom usually physically in the Torah, whereas wisdom of Solomon talks about wisdom being this separate from God, but also like God himself. Very similar to how Philo of Alexandria, and they're both from Alexandria, Egypt, similar to how Philo of Alexandria had talked about the divine Logos being like God, with God, and also God in a sense. Wisdom of Solomon talks about talks about wisdom being with God, like God, and God itself in a sense. And so, and most people would even call the Wisdom of Solomon Apocrypha. But it seems that Apocrypha should be understood as a genre. So, just like sci-fi or romance, it has its own characteristics. And the characteristics of the Apocrypha is that it seems to be like the Bible, but it's not the Bible. It's inspired by the Bible, but it's not the Bible. So, that's the definition of Apocrypha. And within the Apocrypha, notice how this goes on the outside, and then within it, we have Pseudepigrapha. Now, graphe, that's a writing, and pseudo means fake. Think of a pseudonym. So these are writings from false people. In other words, no, Enoch did not write the book of 1 Enoch. And no, the 12 patriarchs, the sons of Israel, did not write the testament of the 12 patriarchs. And Adam and Eve, who didn't even write at all, did not write the life of Adam and Eve. But they are texts written from their perspective that give theological commentary on that situation, as well as they oftentimes give commentary on the situations of the authors in the times that they are living in. And that is oftentimes how scholars date these works. So, Pseudepigrapha, super fascinating, and again, it has its own connections to things. But that falls within the Apocrypha. So first, I'm going to go through the Apocrypha. Now, there are different collections of the Apocrypha. There are different books considered Apocrypha by different people. So that just gets really muddled and confusing. And that's, again, why I think it's most important to think of Apocrypha as a genre and Pseudepigrapha as a subgenre. And these have their own subgenres within it. For example, the Apocrypha, and Apocrypha is plural, Apocryphon, with an H-O-N at the end instead of it being H-A. Apocryphon is how you refer to a singular Apocrypha. So the Apocryphon 1 Maccabees tells the history of this Jewish leader who comes and takes back the land of Israel from this wicked ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes, who had taken it, and with the help of a lot of Jews who had apostatized, were killing Jews who wanted to follow the Torah at any lengths. So this person nicknamed the Maccabee, Judah, goes in. He kills this guy who had also desecrated the temple, much like Daniel had prophesied and talked about. He kills this guy. He had stopped the sacrifices. Again, just like Daniel talked about, this Antiochus guy had stopped the sacrifices. And so this Maccabee guy, he comes in. He actually doesn't kill this person, but he destroys his forces. This guy actually dies from fear, as 2 Maccabees talks about. And in 1 Maccabees, they rebuild the temple, make it right again. And he takes back Judah, the land of Judah, in the 2nd century BC, and it becomes its own. And you can see how this is actually a prototype for how the Jews would see their Messiah to come, as somebody who would come in and destroy the Romans. So 1 Maccabees tells that from a sort of a more historical slant. But again, it's using a lot of terms that are found in the Hebrew scriptures that are outdated. So it refers to some non-Israelites as being Edomites or Philistines and so on and so forth when those people had been gone. But it's trying to show itself within the light of the Hebrew scriptures. So for that reason, it's considered an Apocryphon. Now notice that I called it 1 Maccabees and not 1st Maccabees. And that's because unlike 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 1st and 2nd Kings, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, this is not a two-parter. 2 Maccabees is written by a totally different author than 1 Maccabees at a totally different time to tell, yes, a story about the same person, but with a different slant. So 2 Maccabees is much more theological. And instead, again, it focuses in on this mother and her 7 children who were being tortured by this Antiochus Epiphanes. And they are martyred because they refuse to disobey Torah and to apostatize. And this is actually what Hebrews is referring to when it talks about people who gave up the immediate resurrection for a better coming resurrection, is this mother and her 7 sons. And 2 Maccabees is actually very similar theologically to the idea of Jesus' atonement and dying for the sins of Israel. Because 2 Maccabees says that the reason that Antiochus Epiphanes could have even taken and desecrated the temple in the first place was because of the disobedience of the Jews and them allowing him to come in and actually inviting him and helping him to destroy faithful Jews. Likewise, it says that because of the death of these Jewish martyrs, that God looked with favor on Israel again and allowed this person, Judah Maccabee, to come in and to defeat him and his armies and restore the temple in Israel. So that's 2 Maccabees. 3 Maccabees is based on 1 Maccabees, but it's written as if it was something that actually happened in Alexandria, Egypt. It's not historical. Even less historical is Judith. And Judith, you might call another Maccabee tale. Now, technically, there's a 5 and 6 Maccabees, but those are much different and less significant and not really talked about as much because they're not the same. But Judith, if you read it, you'll realize that it's actually really not historical at all. It actually presents itself in that way because if I remember correctly, it says Nebuchadnezzar was leading the Assyrian forces and that he's coming to destroy all these people. And it gives this allegory, this interesting allegorical story about this Israelite who comes in, seduces this general who's trying to destroy Israel, and then beheads him in the night, hangs up his head on the temple, and then leads Israel to come and destroy these forces. And so this is actually an allegory for a story found in 1 and 2 Maccabees where Judah Maccabee destroys this leader Holofernes. Then you also have the book of Tobit, and Tobit is its own rom-com. It's a romantic comedy. Really interesting book where this guy is a poor exile living in Assyria. And then he has this money that he had deposited further away. So he sends his son to go with it. And this angel goes and guides him, but he's disguised as a human. Yep, that's right. Think of Hebrews, which is definitely referring to Genesis 18 when it talks about entertaining angels in disguise, but also probably had Tobit in mind. We can't know for sure, but it seems like it. And within it, embedded in the book of Tobit, is at the end the father commanding his son how to live a righteous life, and especially giving to the poor, what's called almsgiving, which you see is a very prominent theme also in Jesus' teachings. And if you read this book like I did, you'll notice that Jesus actually has a lot more to say about alms than first meets the eye when you're not really looking for it. Jesus, son of Sirah, writes a wisdom text. So think of mainly Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and some Psalms, a few of them, and Job are wisdom literature. But Jesus, son of Sirah, kind of writes his own type of Proverbs, not to override the other ones, but he says that he's been collecting wisdom. This guy, Jesus, he's actually the grandson of Sirah. He's the son of Eleazar, son of Sirah. And Sirah was leading this school for scribes. And so he would give people wisdom from the TaNaKh. Well, this guy, Jesus, wanted to translate his writings from Hebrew into Greek. And he also added in his own wisdom at the end and gives a preface to it, which is now an introduction. Now, this book goes by many names. It's also called Ecclesiasticus. If you know a little bit of Greek, ecclesia means church. So it was known as the book of the church because so much moral exhortation was used in sermons for the early church. It's most often known as Jesus ben Sirah. Again, the name Jesus is the same as the name Joshua. That's the same name. But I could say you could consider it not being an Apocrypha. That's why I've kind of outlined it. But you could also consider it an Apocrypha because it is the same type of literature as what we find in the Hebrew Scriptures, wisdom literature. But at the same time, it's pretty similar to the treatises that Philo wrote in that it's just giving wisdom. It's not telling a story. So I think you could debate either way. Again, I put it in the Apocrypha. I don't think the Apocrypha is a nicely bound group of texts. I think it should be seen more like a genre. Now, if you're looking for an Apocrypha to read, some translations of the Bible actually just have their own Apocrypha. So you could even find it for free on the NRSV translation. If you get a Catholic one, it just means that it has the Apocrypha with it. You could also read a KJV Apocrypha. That's right, the original KJV and Bibles up until I think it was around the 19th century were all printing out the Apocrypha in them. And the biggest reason they stopped was just because it cost so much money to print those extra pages, and they wanted to make Bibles affordable. They didn't see it as being part of the Bible, but being so helpful that they added it in as an appendix. So my recommendation would be the Oxford Annotated Apocrypha. And you can even get the new Oxford Annotated Bible with Apocrypha if you want them both together. I have my own separate version of the Oxford Annotated Bible, but I would highly recommend this. It has a little bit of annotations. It's not like a full commentary, but it has annotations and it's helpful. And since we're going to get into Pseudepigrapha, if you want to get just a little bit of Pseudepigrapha, you can pick up these Hermenia translations of the Pseudepigrapha. They only have one Enoch and Jubilees at the moment, but they're very easy to read and understand, and it's small. It just has that apocryphal book. And these are the two most popular Pseudepigrapha. So if you want to just get started and maybe test this stuff out, maybe pick up one of these. I have these, but then I also have James H. Charlesworth's 2-volume set of the Pseudepigrapha. This is the most amount of Pseudepigrapha you will get together. There are 66 pseudepigrapha in this. And as you can see, it's definitely larger than a Bible. There are great scholarly introductions that explain the texts, the dating, the provenance, the author, the historical, theological significance of the text, relation to the Old Testament, to the Apocrypha, and if I remember correctly, the New Testament as well. And there are also references to the Hebrew scriptures written alongside them, as well as to other Apocrypha. And these are just the best, most literal translations. This is awesome. I got both of these together. They're both 1,000 pages each about. I got these for like $50 together on Amazon. It's so awesome. It's affordable. If you know you're going to get into this stuff, or you at least want to be able to reference any of these that you can, you need to pick this up. Now, Charlesworth is not to be confused with Charles, because there's also a Charles. And Charles has his own translation of some of the Pseudepigrapha and some of the Apocrypha. Again, it's a 2-volume set. I don't have it just yet. It's very highly recommended by a lot. I don't think it's the same as Charlesworth's translation. Charlesworth did not translate all of them, but he got together a committee of leading scholars on all these works to do their own translations. So it seems like his is better, especially when I compare it even with the Hermania. It's more literal. Not to say that Hermania is paraphrastic, but Charles also has a translation of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Again, not close to as extensive as Charlesworth's, but still really good and really solid. So, with that said, those are my recommendations for these. As you can see, I've read these myself. I've got into them. I've taken notes on them. I marked them up. They're old, they're rusty. I really enjoy it. This stuff is just awesome. It's great. That's just my own special advertisement that nobody asked me to make. But if you want to get into any of these are my recommendations. Now, for the Pseudepigrapha. Again, most people would consider Wisdom of Solomon to be an Apocryphan because it is... well, it's just considered to be part of the Apocrypha. But it seems to claim that it's written by Solomon. It doesn't use his name, but in the text, it talks about somebody asking for wisdom and being a king. And it's pretty clear that it's written as if from Solomon's perspective. So I would consider it a pseudepigraphan written in the name of Solomon, even though Solomon didn't write it, and we know that. It's a really great work. Again, very similar to Philo in wisdom being like God but different from God. And remember, in 1 Corinthians, Paul says that Jesus is the wisdom of God. Very interesting. It is a wisdom text, and so it has its exhortations and tells you what's right and wrong. 2 Maccabees and Wisdom of Solomon are my favorite Apocrypha. And Wisdom of Solomon is also in a lot of ways similar to the apostolic writings because of that. But it also gives this really cool retelling of the whole Hebrew scriptures, kind of like Proverbs 8 talks about God creating the world with wisdom. Wisdom of Solomon talks about wisdom working like God with all the characters, all the major characters in the Hebrew scriptures. It also really hones into the plagues narrative and the whole narrative of the Torah. And pretty much the point is, whatever people did that was wrong or evil, they got a reciprocal action to go against it. So, for example, it talks about how the Egyptians threw the Israelite babies into the Nile for them to drown and for them to die. Well, that's exactly why one of the plagues was that they would have that same river turned into blood. And in the same way, they were drowned themselves by God when he brought down the Red Sea upon them. So it shows how there's this cause and effect for people. And it goes even more depth into this. It's so awesome. It'll give you so many insights into the Hebrew scriptures. And it's one of the reasons why it's my favorite. Again, this is a wisdom text, much like Proverbs, or Ecclesiastes, or Job. There's also what's called the Prayer of Manasseh. Manasseh is the most evil king in all Israel. In Kings, it says that, and then he's one of the kings that goes into exile. And only in Chronicles does it talk about how he repents whenever he's in exile, and then God forgives him. It just gives that short explanation. And so somebody wrote a sort of prayer of repentance as if they were Manasseh. It's this short thing. It's literally just one chapter long. And it's a really nice prayer of penitence. Then you also have the book of Jubilees. In my former video on the order of the Old Testament, I talk about Jubilees and its interpretation of the Torah. It's a retelling of the Torah up to the time of the Sinai, especially majoring on Genesis. So again, I talk about how it implements a lot of the themes that you see that are repeated in the motifs. It teaches you about those if you read it. So I'm not going to get into that because I already explained that in my past video. But it's a really good book. The reason it's called Jubilees, a Jubilee is after every 7 sets of 7 years. Every 7 years, the Israelites would have to release their people. And then after every 7 sets of 7 years, which is 50 years, because it comes after 49, which is 7 times 7, there would be a big release. And so the book of Jubilees retells everything, but it tells you how many Jubilees it's been for everything, and it counts it up that way. And it's a little bit more apologetic and makes the patriarchs look a little bit better than they actually were. But it also has a lot of good theological commentary. You also have books like The Life of Adam and Eve that talks about Adam and Eve and their life in the garden being expelled. Again, good, solid theological commentary, but it's also just a really interesting book. I find Life of Adam and Eve and Jubilees and 1 Enoch to be some of the most interesting pseudepigrapha. You also have the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. Now, this is its own genre. Not that there aren't other texts of this genre. The Testament is a genre that we see even in the Apostolic writings. The Testament was, when somebody was right about to die, they would speak to their sons or to their followers, and they would give them wisdom. Sometimes they would talk about their life. This is especially true in the Testament of Job. But really, most of it is talking about, this is where I went wrong, and this is what you need to do that's right. So, for example, Reuben, who slept with his mom to try and become the alpha male of the family, he's one of the 12 patriarchs of the sons of Israel. And Reuben tells his sons, hey, sexual sin is really evil. Don't do that. I did that, and you should learn from my lesson. And so you can tell that the people who wrote these texts are trying to give their own wisdom for what you should and shouldn't do based on that. Now, although this is different in a sense, it's also very similar in a sense. Jesus has his upper room discourse, which should really be called the Testament of Jesus. And this is the latter half of the Gospel of John, up until his death, is Jesus is giving his testament to his disciples. This is what you are to do, to love one another, and he goes on and gives them that wisdom. That is, in a sense, testamental literature. And last but not least, I think this is the most talked about and most popular pseudepigraphon. And it was the most popular pseudepigraphon of Jesus' day as well. For crying out loud, Jesus' half-brother, Jude or Judah, actually quotes the book 1 Enoch. Now, 1 Enoch is what's known as composite literature, which means that it's not just one book in and of itself, it's 5 smaller books written separately at different times by different people, and the later authors, numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5, were inspired by the first author. And so they write and they connect it all together. And later, one redactor, sort of similar to the TaNaKh, finds all these, stitches them together, adds in a couple of other explanatory notes into the book, and that's how you get 1 Enoch. It's about 105 chapters, if I remember correctly. And the book is really interesting at the beginning especially. So there's 5 books. The 2 big books are the Book of the Watchers, which is the first 37 chapters, and I believe the next couple 35 chapters or so is the Book of the Luminaries, Book of Similitudes, Book of the Parables. There are 5 different books in it. And it tells the story of the Watchers, the sons of God coming to sleep with the sons of men. And this is the popular, more explicit interpretation of Genesis 6, where it talks about the divine beings sleeping with the women, giving birth to giants, and the evil that's happening in that time. And it's a sort of allegory, in a sense, for what's happening at the time of the people who are writing it during the Maccabean period, when a lot of Jews are being unfaithful and giving into sexual promiscuity. It's writing that into Genesis 6 and it's retelling. But it's also giving a lot of theological commentary. It talks a lot about Enoch going into heaven and him seeing Gehenna, which is translated as hell in the New Testament. And it talks about him seeing the Son of Man seated with God. Very similar to Daniel. And again, Jesus is obviously picking up on Daniel, and this commentary is fresh in people's minds when he's talking about that, about himself with his followers. This is what's known as an apocalyptic text, where usually somebody is taken through the heavens, they're taken around the cosmos, they're shown all different types of things, usually by a tour guide angel who will explain all the questions that they have for them. And we see this in what's called the apocalypse, or the revelation. Now again, apocalypse does not mean end of the world. The Greek word, I believe it's apokalypto, just means revelation or unveiling. And that is the Greek word for the name of revelation. It's about a revealing of things to come. And even Paul's epistle, Ephesians, is apocalyptic. It's talking about a mystery, which is all throughout apocalyptic literature talked about this mystery that God has kept secret and won't reveal until the time to come. Now, it usually also does talk about the end times, but it's called apocalypse because it's a revelation. Now, there are many more Pseudepigrapha and Apocrypha. There's 1 and 2 Esdras. There's the Testament of Job, Testament of Solomon. So many, many more. Like I said, just in Charlesworth's translations of the Pseudepigrapha alone, there are 66. And there are even other Apocrypha. But these are the major ones. And here I hope that I've helped you to get a better understanding of kind of what was it that these did. What is the purpose of these? Why did these even exist? Why is it important to read them? I think it's very helpful to read them. Just know that they're not inspired, they're not infallible, they're not perfect, but they are even great texts, and they're really helpful. And I really hope that you will all enjoy them just